On June 14, 1931, a man named Adolph Ruth gets off his donkey that he had been riding on for hours in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. Little did he know that the spot he was standing at was going to make him a very rich man. He was going to be the first person to find the lost Dutchman gold mine. Hundreds of others never came back when looking for the Dutchman gold mine, but Dr. Ruth had an advantage compared to the hundreds before him. He had a treasure map that would get him to the gold mine. As he was reaching for his treasure map, he heard someone grunting from behind him. Dr. Ruth immediately turns around. Dr. Ruth saw that it was the two cowboy guides that brought him here. Dr. Ruth just said,
"What?"
Dr. Ruth was an old retired veterinarian and a government employee who worked in Washington, D.C., who wore glasses. Dr. Ruth had told the cowboys to leave once they brought him to the spot he wanted to go, but the cowboys hesitated. After all, Dr. Ruth was an old man alone in the desert. The cowboys knew how all the people died who went into the canyon to find the gold mine. The cowboys approached Dr. Ruth and told them that they didn't think that this was a good idea. Dr. Ruth gave them some extra money and said that he was fine. The cowboys looked at each other, shrugged their shoulders, and started galloping away. Dr. Ruth got back on his donkey and started galloping deeper into the canyon. As the sun was starting to set, Dr. Ruth decided it was a good time to stop and set up camp. He reached inside his bag, opened his notebook, and took out his treasure map. Dr. Ruth's son got the treasure map from a man in Mexico, and the man in Mexico got the treasure map from miners who worked in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. The miners had all been massacred, but somehow the treasure map still managed to be found. As Dr. Ruth was looking at his treasure map, he was distracted by a huge rock formation that was way off in the distance. He couldn't stop thinking that it looked like a giant gravestone. He looked back at the map and realized that the drawing on the map where the treasure was going to be was this giant gravestone-looking rock. This rock is called Weaver's Needle. He put away his map and thought to himself, "Great, tomorrow I'll head straight to Weaver's Needle." He sat down and ate his meat and beans. Because of the silence, he started to whistle. When the doctor was finished with his meal, everything around him was pitch black and silent. He suddenly heard a weird noise coming from the mountains. It sounded like hooves running on stone, and it echoed through the whole canyon. Dr. Ruth felt relieved that he wasn't the only one out there. Dr. Ruth called,
"Who is there?"
but he received no answer. It was completely silent again. All he heard was coyotes throughout the canyon. He was terrified and thought of all the stories of weird people stalking the visitors of the Superstition Mountains at night. So he decided to go into his tent and sleep. In the middle of the night, he suddenly wakes up. He looks outside of his tent and sees eyes staring at him. His heart started to race. The eyes blinked and vanished. He took his gun and screamed.
"I'll shoot if you come back."
He stayed up for a couple more hours to see if there were any noises or if he could see anything or anyone, but saw and heard nothing. Eventually, he fell back asleep. When he woke up in the morning, he investigated the scene where he saw the eyes staring at him. He saw that there were a bunch of coyote tracks. At first, he felt relieved, walked a few meters away from his tent, and saw that there were a bunch of tracks that were not coyote tracks. The tracks looked like human barefoot tracks that were the size of a child. For a second, he thought that they were his footprints, but he wasn't where the tracks were, and he wasn't walking around barefoot. The prints went around his tent multiple times. There were no signs that the footprints were walking away in a certain direction. It looked like they suddenly vanished. Dr. Ruth was terrified. He rushed back into his tent, packed his things, hopped on his donkey, and started heading towards Weaver's Needle. After a few hours, he reached Weaver's Needle. He looked at his map and saw that the treasure had to be located somewhere close to him. He continued following the map and came across a cacti that had multiple axes stuck inside it. He looked back at his map and realized that it had a drawing of something that probably resembled the cacti. Dr. Ruth assigned his location to the one on the map and found a small path that led to the base of Weaver's Needle.
"The treasure must be there,"
he said. He got off his donkey, grabbed his pickaxe, and as he started moving towards the path, he heard something behind him. He turned around, but by the time he managed to see anything, it was too late. An explosion went off. 10 days later, the two cowboy guides that brought Dr. Ruth into the Superstition Mountains went to come check on him. They found this abandoned tent and searched the entire area for traces of Dr. Ruth. A 45-day search for Dr. Ruth was conducted, but no one managed to find any signs. The search was called off, and Dr. Ruth assumed dead. About 100 days later, another set of explorers went into Weaver's Needle and found a skull on the ground. It was Dr. Ruth's skull, and it had 2 big holes at the side of it. A month later, another set of explorers found his skeleton roughly 1.61 kilometers away from where his skull was found. When authorities investigated his death, they quickly said he died of natural causes and closed the case. When they investigated his campsite and looked through his notebook that was lying there, they went through it, and it was Dr. Ruth's writing as expected. But towards the last pages, they found some sort of new handwriting with some weird text that said Veni Vidi Vici. It's Latin and means I came, I saw, I conquered. To this day, no one knows who wrote the note and why they did it. But people believe it's the same individual that is responsible for Dr. Ruth's death. A year later, a man named Guy Frank followed the tracks of Dr. Ruth. He managed to find the lost Dutchman's treasure and returned home with the gold. A month later, Guy Frank was found dead in the Superstition Mountains with a gunshot wound to the stomach. A pile of high-value gold ore was left next to his corpse. The individual who caused his death might have been the same individual who was responsible for Dr. Adolph Ruth's death. It suggests that Dr. Ruth was about to find the treasure, and whoever witnessed him almost finding the treasure killed him to prevent him from finding it. 13 years later, an explorer named Barry Storm, who published a book on the case to finally find out what happened to Dr. Ruth, talks in the book about how he went into the Superstition Mountains to solve the mystery of what happened to Dr. Ruth when suddenly someone started firing warning shots at him. He took cover behind a rock and looked to see where the shots were coming from, but he couldn't see anyone. When he began to take steps further into the canyon, he again got shot at. He eventually fled the scene. Barry Storm told others that whoever shot at him seemed like to shoot warning shots at him. Who knows what would have happened to Barry Storm hadn't he fled the scene and ventured even deeper into the Superstition Mountains like Dr. Ruth did. No one knows exactly what happened to Dr. Ruth or the hundreds of others who went missing when looking for the lost Dutchman treasure. Some people speculate it's a maniac that is killing people. Others believe that someone is guiding something from the public. To this day, the mystery of the Superstition Mountains lives on, and multiple people who venture into the Superstition Mountains have been reported missing or dead almost 100 years after Dr. Ruth's death. Whatever is lurking out there has been killing people for centuries. Who knows if the mystery will ever get solved? Still, about 9,000 people venture into the Superstition Mountains every year to find gold or to solve the mystery that has been lurking in the Superstition Mountains for centuries.